podcast, and she is also a podcaster with the Wondering Mind podcast. Now, Emily, this is kind of a surprise to all the new guests, right? I have a icebreaker question for you before you introduce yourself. And you'll like this one. You'll love this. What if you could mandate anything for mental health, what would it be?
If I could mandate anything. Wow. I'm trying to think. If I could, I don't know. I guess it would just be, what do you mean by mandate? Like, what do you?
I would say, like, let's say, well, just like we see what's going on in the world today, we have all these random rules going on. If somebody was working for your company for their mental health, what would they have to do every single day?
Oh, in regards to, okay.
Yeah, like a mandate.
I would say time off, mental health time off that's separate from your PTO, because I feel as though a lot of folks use PTO for vacation, but now they have to use it for doctor's visits and mental health days and sick days. It's like there's not enough of it. So separating that and mandating and setting aside PTO time for mental health days only would be lovely.
I love that, because it's so true. You always have to use up your vacation or sick days.
You
like,
do.
What happens if you actually want to take a vacation
Exactly.
or a sick day?
Yeah, and there are some businesses where, I mean, PTO is not even an option. If you're in the restaurant industry, if you're in retail, I mean, that's not typically a thing. So I think across the board, mandating it for all corporations, allowing their employees to have a PTO or like a mental health bank of, accumulated time that they're allowed to take.
Yeah, and this is going to roll really nicely into, me asking you for a background of yourself, but I was going to say a thing that, along with that mandate, it's really nice that you separate sick days from mental health days, because so many people will use sick days because they're burnt out, and that's part of mental health. Like, you're just physically, mentally done, and the fact that you can actually take a mental health day rather than a sick day would just be such a good distinction. So with that, I want to let you go ahead and introduce yourself, introduce your podcast, because it also has to do with mental health.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I'm Emily Elizabeth, and I host, like you said, the Wondering Mind podcast. I started the show. This is our third year. Like, we just entered into the third year of the show. Yeah. So season 3, I started the show because I was sick and tired of feeling so alone in all the things that I was going through. And after going through a pretty tumultuous breakup back in 2019, the beginning of 2019, like April, I think.
Right.
Before we actually broke up, I started working on myself because I felt it was going to save the relationship. I felt if I started putting more time and effort into myself and taking care of all the things that were quote unquote wrong with me, it would save my relationship. And it didn't. But yeah, I mean, I feel like a lot of folks can relate to that too. They feel like, let me fix myself, and then when I'm complete and whole and better and healed, my whole life will be hunky dory. Like, no, that's not how it works. However, since I started to do that prior to the breakup, I was able to handle the breakup a lot better. I was able to come out of that depression a lot faster. I was able to bounce back. And I've never been able to do that before. And so that's kind of when it hit me. I was like, I want to share with people that this is possible, that you can be in the lowest of lows. But if you're consistently still working on yourself throughout that time anyway, it's definitely going to help and make a difference. And so I was like, you know what? Let's do it. So I pulled the plug.
Okay, no, if you mind me asking, because you are the first one that's been on the podcast that's been open about a relationship that obviously we've all been there. And I cringed because I understand that all too well. And it happened to me like in 2020. I started the pandemic, and I get it. So I want to ask you this. How long was it? I guess let me start here with mental health wise. Did this ex-significant other, were they trying to point out to you that maybe your mental health was declining? Maybe it wasn't where they wanted it to be, like, quote unquote. I don't want to go into that controlling side of it, but like, was it you, or them that realized it? And why did you think it was going to save the relationship?
So I realized that my mental health was declining.
Okay.
This person just saw me as stagnant, was complaining I was sleeping too much, was complaining that I wasn't doing enough, that I was just going through the motions,
Right.
and I wasn't active, I wasn't involved. And I realized that I was depressed, that I hated my job, that I didn't have any hobbies, that I didn't have any passions. And so there was a disconnect there. There was a huge disconnect. And there was a disconnect there our entire relationship. What he saw was just surface level. He wasn't willing to actually dive in and be like, what is wrong with you? How can
Right.
I help? What is going on? He gave me an ultimatum and said, if you're not better in 6 months, we're breaking up. So I guess I was at such a fucked up point. Sorry, can I cuss on here? I was
Yeah,
such
of
a
course. Go for it.
okay.
We've all heard the words.
I, I was at such a low point at that time that I didn't stand up for myself when he said that to me. And so I took it to heart and I was like, okay, like I'm going to work on this. I'm going to do everything in my power instead of it being a two-way street.
Right.
So, yes and no, but it was mainly me that realized my mental health was declining and he just knew something was off.
That's so hard. And again, hold on, time out. Are you hearing feedback?
Like echoing?
Yeah. Well, no, a feedback, like when you talk, it like talks over you.
What do you mean?
Hold on one second. I'm going to just stop this because I want to hear
Okay.
something really quick because this has happened before and I just worry about it. And I want to get too.
You want to hear what it sounds like?
We're good. We're good. I just got worried because I was like, I was hearing feedback and I was like, oh,
Does it
crap.
sound okay? That's weird. What
It
does it
sounds
sound
okay
like?
now. I think it was a loose cord on my end, but last
Oh,
time
okay.
this happened with somebody, it sounded robotic. Remember we had that problem?
Oh
I
my
think I
god, that was
recorded the whole
horrible.
thing with this one woman with that sound. It was awful. I had to have her redo it. I asked her to. I was like, "Oh, this is so my fault." She did. She was so sweet. I was like, "Oh
Oh
Lord
my
God."
gosh.
So that's why I was like, "Okay, I don't want to get too far and it sounds bad." All
I'm
right.
glad you
So,
checked. I'm glad you
take
checked.
2. We're going to just take off right where we're from.
Yeah.
All right. So we went from what was the last?
Talking about how did he recognize it or did I recognize it or
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. So at what point did you start to make that change within that 6 months or after that 6 months?
And I was definitely within that 6 months. I also think it was a combination of the words that he said and the ultimatum that he gave me. And it
Right.
was also just the emptiness and the loneliness and the depression that I was so over. I was just so over feeling like that. And so I was going to do anything I could anyways. So it was almost like divine timing just in a really fucked up way.
Yeah.
It was like setting myself up for, you know, this door to close and then other doors to open, but I just didn't know it at the time. So I started going to therapy again. I started getting on medication. I worked out like 3 to 4 times a week. That was my saving grace. Working out was the thing that I was almost obsessed with at the time, and it was so great. And I would do it every evening after I got off work. I would go do a workout class and I would come home and I'd be like, "Oh, I feel so great," like chatting with him and like, and it just helped so much. And fortunately, the things that I did weren't enough, and they never would have been enough because it just wasn't the right fit. But yeah, I'm just so glad I did it.
It's one of those things where it's like you can't say enough of the right things to the wrong person.
Mhm.
And we always try. We always try, but it is what it is. But like I want to ask you because like obviously if somebody's ever dealt with depression, anxiety, things like that, it's not just a flip of the switch. Movies make it seem like, I just wake up one day, the sun is shining and I'm on good to go. But we all know it's not. So within that time frame, how long did it actually take you to not, I wouldn't say get over it, but to find ways to manage it? Because again, that takes a long period of time. That probably took a little bit longer than maybe just that one side of the relationship. Are you still working on it?
Oh, good question. Yes, no, I'm for sure still working on it. I mean, depression, anxiety, and ADHD are always going to be something that I'm struggling with, just different layers to it, I guess.
Mhm.
But I have so many different tools in my toolbox now that I'm able to handle it a lot better. At that point, no, it was not within the 6 months. It definitely started to improve because of all the work that I had been putting in. But no, I was still very depressed, but I think one of the things that really helped was I started finding hobbies outside of work, outside of friends, something that I loved, because with that past relationship, I completely lost my identity within, and that was another trigger and reason why I was so depressed. So I started doing makeup, and I got on YouTube and I started doing YouTube videos, and then I would buy all this fun new makeup and I would do these tutorials and watch these videos, and it was just it was an outlet. It was inspiring,
Right.
it was motivating, and it gave me something to be excited about and look forward to. And so that was another out for me. Another outlet that I could use my emotions in the way that I was feeling in a positive way.
And so you were saying with the podcast, because you
Mhm.
wanted to share it with other people, because it's a lonely feeling. And we again, a lot of us somehow we're all there on top of
Right.
this lonely feeling. Like we're like, "Oh yeah, I'm alone too." And I'm like, "Well, if we're all alone, like isn't the answer in front of our face?" When we're
Right.
sitting here like, "No, I'm so alone." And I get it. And at what point did you realize, well, maybe if I shared my story with people, maybe it would fill not fill the whole void, but fill the void in you and you'd be able to help people. What point was that at?
Very shortly after I launched my first episode. So at the time, the whole thing, like the whole idea kind of sparked from me at the time listening to a couple of different motivational podcasts. And I was just like, these are so incredible. They made me feel so good after I listened to them. And so that's kind of what sparked my whole idea and encouraged me to just go for it. But after I released my first couple of episodes, that people started, like strangers started reaching out to me in DMs and stuff, and we would just have these conversations, these deep conversations, and I was like, wow. It kind of hit me that I really am not the only one that goes through stuff like this. And it all starts with a conversation. And so that kind of just fueled the fire. And it did fill it it didn't honestly, it didn't really start to fill the void um until recently, not gonna lie.
Yeah.
Because I've experienced so many different aspects of how to run the podcast and how to connect with others. And so in the beginning, yeah, it was a good feeling, but it wasn't what it is now. But that's where it started.
And how do you see yourself? I mean, what kind of things are people relating to?
Everything. And you know what's
Everything.
funny? I think the most rewarding thing that I get out of doing the show is whenever I interview someone and they're up there and they're telling their story, and I'm just sitting there like, yep. Like, just shaking my head. I, like, agreeing with
Right.
every single thing, and it's wild because they go through such different experiences, but at the end of the day, we all kind of feel the same way about all of these different wild things that we go through, and it blows my mind every time just to hear someone tell their story, and I'm like, "I know how you feel." Like, I've dealt with that in some shape or form, and I can relate to you, and it's just a very, powerful feeling.
It's really interesting that we've all felt those same emotions and nobody can put them in the words, almost like be able to talk to each other about it. And I think, I mean, for me personally, that's why I've always kind of been attracted to music. So
Mm,
music, especially like some of the artists, they might sound depressing or whatever, what grandma might say, like, "Why would you listen to that really depressing music?" I'm like, if you listen to the words, it's
mhm.
like even if it's like happy song or a painful song, they're so relatable because some of these artists do such an awesome job of putting feelings into something you can't explain, into music that you're just like, "I feel this, it's great." And I mean, I think that's kind of like, did you start realizing that with your podcast, people are putting these feelings that you've never had, like you've never been able to explain to somebody, and they finally like gave you words for yourself.
Exactly, exactly. That's a very good way to like relate the two.
Yeah.
Listening to songs that you just feel in your gut and the words that you hear, you're like, I feel this, but there's no way I could have explained this. That's the same way that I feel when I hear these people tell their stories, exactly the same way.
So what do you think of the current like state of mental health in society? Do you think it's getting better? Do you think it's just becoming, an actual not taboo topic to talk about, or do you think we're actually declining?
Oof, that's a good question. I personally think it's getting better. We're definitely nowhere near where it should be by any means.
Right.
But as a whole, I think society is getting more comfortable having these conversations. Corporations are starting to come out and talk about mental health with their employees. um, Different events are happening, podcasts are popping up about mental health, people are telling their stories online on social media, books are being written. I mean, it's definitely a slow process, but over the past 5 years it's definitely progressed, and it's such a good feeling because for so long, like literally my entire life, because I've been dealing with this since I was in elementary school, it was such a taboo thing, and it was something that was so uncomfortable to talk about, and so you just pretended like you were quote unquote normal and that your brain was wired the exact same way as everyone else, and it made it
Right.
really difficult. So it's almost like this big weight has been lifted and continues to lift the more that people talk about it, and the more openly like society is willing to go there about mental health. So I personally feel as though it's progressing in a positive way.
No, I have to agree with you because I mean, just thinking back even in elementary school when, ADHD was kind of hush hush. You wouldn't talk about ADHD, anxiety and depression, throw that out the window. Like nobody said a word about that. Maybe in high school I saw some of it, and if you had anxiety or depression, it was almost like you were in the special classes. Like that's
Yeah,
how people looked at you.
exactly.
And to, like, look back on it, I'm like, "Oh my god, what was wrong with us?" Like, we were all
You're
anxious,
brainwashed.
right?
No, and everyone was anxious and depressed.
Everybody was anxious and depressed, and, like, that's why we have such this, like, weird flip going on because, like, high schoolers now are actually able to talk about it. They're actually able to, like, do something about it. Because I honestly think it was just used to be, like, silently medicated. That's just honestly what we used to happen.
Yep, 100%. It was, and I really like that you said, like you were almost in the special ed class, if you will. I mean, that's not far from the truth. I feel if someone said they were anxious or depressed, one, you're going to get looked at like you were crazy
Right.
and labeled and stereotyped and considered emo, or you had all these issues, and people just didn't know how to deal with it then,
Right.
because we were still stuck in that trend of just shoving everything under the rug, medicating ourselves, drinking, whatever. It wasn't a thing. So I'm really glad that high schoolers and even like elementary school students, I'm glad it's
Yeah.
becoming a thing in schools too. Not anywhere near where it should be, but we're getting there. So
Big time. Now, what do you think the effect of the pandemic has been?
ooh, yeah, you
I
already
know,
know.
I know that question. Not good.
Not good. Well, so it's kind of like a it's good and it's bad. So I say that the pandemic, when like the very beginning of 2020 hit, and everyone was like, "Ooh, yay, we're gonna get like time to be at home and we can reconnect. It'll be so great." And then they're like, "Fuck this! Like, I'm so over
And we're
this."
like, "This is not good."
But I think for a lot of folks, it actually made a really significant impact in a positive way, because it allowed people to sit with what they didn't want to sit with before and come to terms with it. And even if they didn't come to terms with it, they still knew something was going on. So I do know from personal experience talking to my therapist, she said that her clientele went up like crazy, which is a good thing. I mean, it's not because people were struggling, but it is because they
Right.
were willing to go seek help. And I think because of the pandemic, I think that was a huge catapult when it comes to mental health in society. I think without the pandemic, mental health would still be a lot more taboo than it is right now. But because of that, and because so many people experienced mental health issues, people that never even really have or allowed themselves to feel,
Yeah.
were feeling these things. And so it was just everywhere. I mean, everyone was talking about mental health that whole year. So
Yeah, and
I think it was good and bad.
we're still talking about it. I mean, like,
Yeah.
look at these corporations. I think the
Mhm.
corporations are almost like starting to crumble just because people are realizing I can't do this.
Yeah.
Like it's just
Jig
like
is up.
the great awakening of that like dying 9 to 5 where it's that sad cycle where it's like you wake up, you go to work, you come home, eat some food, go to bed. Repeat 1,000 times until you retire, which
Yeah.
by the time we get up there, it's going to be retiring age is going to be like 82. And life expectancy is going to be like 83 and you're going to be like, "Thanks." Like I appreciate it. Like I
Yeah.
really but like people have started realizing this is not this cannot keep going on. And
Mhm.
like do you think going forward, like I guess we can make a prediction. Do you think the corporations are going to start doing things about it? Cuz like they're trying, but like in a way, personally, I feel like they're just dragging their feet and they're like, okay, just don't go anywhere. We'll do something about mental health and you guys will be happier. Like again, they just throw something at you, give you a little
Mhm.
bit of something, but they don't give you much. What are your predictions for the corporations?
Well, okay, I'll speak generally and then I'll speak to the corporation that I work for because it's a
Yeah.
Fortune 500 company or whatever. It's like a fucking wealthy ass insurance company.
Has a lot of employees. There we go.
It's got a shitload of people. And the guy at the top is wealthy. So anyways,
Yeah.
okay, generally speaking, I think a good chunk of corporations are starting to take it seriously. I think you are correct though in the sense where they're not quite comfortable going all in for
Right.
their employees just yet because most of these companies are in it for the money. I hate to say it, but it's true. As far as smaller corporations, I feel as though they are going in a lot harder for their employees. I hope to see in the future that this becomes a trend and that there's programs and volunteer hours given. And like we were talking about in the very beginning, mental health PTO.
Yeah.
And I wish that corporations would have meetings with their teams, no matter how many teams you have, individual as a whole, whatever, about mental health. Allow your employees to speak up and tell you what they're going through. Because if you have employees, like you said, that are just going through the motions, they're burning themselves
Oh,
out. So if
yeah.
you have thousands of burnt out employees, your company is not going to do well. So if you're that concerned about money, think about it like that. Take care of your employees so that you can continue to make money for your corporation. So I think, generally speaking, I hope that's what happens. But for where I work personally right now, full time, I've been so impressed. It's crazy because I used to complain. I've been with this company. I've been with this company for 6.5 years, and I used to complain a lot about how they didn't really give a shit about the
Yeah.
mental health of their employees. And honestly, again, I wasn't really an advocate for mental health until about 4 years ago because this was all new to me. So I didn't really know or feel comfortable in expressing these emotions to anyone that I worked with up until this year. It took up until this year for me to finally find a team where I could do so. But as a corporation at large, the place where I work has been allowing us to take classes, has been setting up meetings to where we can talk about our mental health. We've been having classes on racism and stuff like that. So they're getting in there. They're starting to recognize what we need in order to be successful as a whole. And it's not just putting in the hours. So, yeah, I hope it improves all across the board.
So let me ask you this because I actually haven't come across somebody that their company's doing something. Because I
Yeah.
work around a lot of like I not work, but I live around like the corporations that are here. They're all government run, and I'm honestly just pooped out on whatever the government runs, I'm sure it's just not going to go very well around here. So I'm just going to give it up on them. But no offense to anybody that works to them. No offense. You know what I'm talking about working in there. But what is the response inside the company from the people that are taking these classes?
The response has been good. I think that it's still so new, though, that the way that you have to approach these from a corporation's perspective for the employees is challenging because
Yeah.
you want the employees to be responsive. And I think it's so new and slightly uncomfortable that people aren't really engaging as much as they can. But I think the more that they push, the more that they open the space up, the more that they talk about these different topics, especially mental health, I think it will have a huge positive impact. But again, it's so new. Um, but the fact that they're doing it is just, it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I'm actually pretty shocked, but at the same time, when we go through a global pandemic, somebody's got to do something,
I
right?
mean,
Like just a little bit, like just pull your weight just a
and
little bit.
you know what's wild too? Our CEO of our company, and mind you, like it's based where I live here, but it's in all 50 states. There's places all, offices all over. But he will write a heartfelt, very personal email to the entire corporation every month, I think. And so the fact that our CEO is actually like taking the time, and he's been doing this for a couple of years, and then they started to get more transparent and vulnerable since the pandemic. So if you have a leader, if you have a CEO who is acting as that, person who's showing you what they want you to do, but he's doing it themselves, like being that person to look up to, you know, that role model,
Right.
it allows everyone else to kind of follow suit. And so I do think that's pretty unheard of in corporations that are so large as this one. But yeah, that's what he does, and I think that helps too. Hearing
No,
it
I
from
have
him.
to agree. And again, I think that's why I think most of the places around me,
Mhm.
just throw that down the drain. Because like I know a few people who know people that work up in the corporate sector, and they just said like there's no hope. Like with a lot of that,
Mhm.
like they don't believe in that. They believe in the hard work and the money, and it's kind of like the older generation, to put
Right.
it lightly, where they're like, "You're fine. Show up at work. I'll see you at 9." And you're like, "Oh." That's just there's just so much more to life now that we see that.
Yeah.
So it's definitely something that it will be interesting what we see going forward. Now, I want to highlight you have an event coming up in
Mhm.
May. Do you want to go
Mhm.
ahead and tell us a little bit about it in Louisville, Kentucky?
Yes, I would love to. So I came up with this idea last spring, and I got a couple folks involved who had been on my show. And through those people, we found a couple other people, amazing group of people. Now we have a team of like 8 folks who are working on this event called Mindfest. It's going to be a mental health festival based in Louisville, Kentucky. It's going to be hosted in our downtown area. And it's really the first mental health festival like this. We also have a festival called the Pete Fest, which is a music festival. So it's like a couple of days in June, and we have this like tons of musical performances, and it's based around suicide and mental health. But we don't really have just strictly mental health where you can come and find resources and engage in activities and discussions, and we'll have DJs and food trucks. It's like a whole event created to build mental health up in the community, provide free resources, and make it a fun experience
That's
because
awesome.
people usually associate mental health with depression and complicated things and uncomfortable conversations.
Great.
So, yeah, it'll be May 21st, 2022.
That's going to be such an awesome event. And you're right. People like usually put mental health with depression, but I think it's the saddest thing is they also put it with if you've been through something really traumatizing, right? And some people, like, I'm not downplaying, I'm not upplaying anybody, but maybe they didn't go through some trauma where it's like, I didn't lose my mom at 2, but I'm still depressed. You know what I mean? Like
Yes.
maybe I haven't gone through a lot of family deaths, or I haven't gone through a fire. I haven't gone through something crazy, but it's like you can still struggle. And I think that was just such a message for a long time where it's like, again, like almost like the top corporate people. you're fine, show up, you're going to be good. Which I think
Mhm.
to a point is good, where I don't want us to ever stop at life. I don't want us to ever be, I guess, inhibited by our mental health. But at the same time, it's like we've got to recognize it. We've got to understand it. We've got to get around it. We've got to cope in healthy ways.
Ooh,
you
yes.
so
Mhm.
actually, that's a good point. What ways did you find, other than, I guess, like, one on top of your outlets, but
Mhm.
what ways do you use today to kind of cope if you feel like you're, kind of spiraling back? I hate to use that word,
No,
but
it's
I
true.
use it all the time for myself. Like, I'm spiraling. What do you do? How do you stop yourself from that?
So if I find that I'm spiraling, just depends on what I'm doing, I guess, but I will typically pick up my phone and call one of my family members, either my mom or my dad, or I'll book a therapy appointment for as quickly
Good.
as I can, just so that I know that I can have someone hold me accountable. But what I've been trying to do a lot lately, and this is like most simplistic yet the most difficult thing to do, is when you find yourself spiraling backwards, is to just give yourself grace. I've always struggled with that because we live in a time where we have to keep hustling, we have to keep working, we
Um,
have to keep going, even if our mental health starts to decline. And so I used to be the kind of person that would just kind of try and fight through it. But now I'm like, mm-mm. I stop myself and I allow myself to rest and just take it easy so that
yeah.
I can kind of it's like I catch myself that way so that I'm able to not spiral as far as I would have normally gone. So I'm and then I also I sit with what I'm going through, which a lot of people don't want to do. So if whatever I try and find the why behind what I'm feeling. So like why am I spiraling right now? What triggered it? What can I do that would make myself feel better? How can I prevent this from like this is how I analytically think through it at this point. And a lot of people just don't have the capacity to do that yet because it's really fucking hard to do. And sometimes I can't do it every time. Um but that's what I try to do. I try and just kind of for example, if I'm spiraling one afternoon, but I know I had pre-engagements later on in the afternoon, I'll reschedule and I'll be like, and I'll feel guilty about it, but the guilt becomes less and less when you realize that you're not going to be your best self and be able to show up for that
Big
engagement
time.
if you're not able to get yourself back in check. And it's just a matter of putting that pride aside and sucking it up and explaining and being transparent as possible to whomever and being like, I'm going to have to reschedule. I'm so sorry. Whether it be a personal engagement or a professional. And then I've also had to brave the storm and kind of talk to my boss about things before. Because my mental health, when I start to spiral, it's not just a day, typically, you
Yeah.
know, it can last a month, it can last a few weeks, however long it takes. And so I am getting better at communicating. That's another thing that I use in my toolbox is communication. And that is something that I sucked at before horribly because, again, I was the one who would suppress everything and get extremely uncomfortable when I was trying to express my feelings to certain people, or I've been shut down by people close to me before telling me like, oh, just, suck it up, get over it. Or it would turn into an argument. So I just wouldn't bring anything up at all. So communication is something that I do when I find myself spiraling, and it's worked wonders, absolute wonders.
You brought up so many good points in there, but I saw something the other day on Instagram, and it
Mhm.
said, "You're discussing how you feel shouldn't end in an argument." And I was
Mhm.
just like, "Oh man, that just like hits way too deep, right?" Like,
Way
because
deep.
we've all had those times where we tried to tell somebody how we felt, and there's just like a blowout fight, and you're like, "You know what? I'll keep it inside of me for the rest of my life." And I think that's where we start to really just not tumble down, but we just kind of start to fall apart, where we just start holding it inside of ourselves. And I think
Yeah.
that's just such an important point that you brought up: communication, 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 and understanding how to communicate your feelings
Hmm.
without, like, that's the reason, like, behavior 101. little kids, they throw tantrums because they can't communicate what they want. As human adults, we have tantrums, they just look different. It's like
Exactly.
they're still tantrums because we're
Yeah.
not communicating. And so that point alone is just like the
It's a game
icing on
changer.
top. Like it
Yeah.
really is a game changer.
Yeah.
Now, I want to ask you, kind of like starting to wrap up the podcast.
Sure.
What? So we kind of got your routines. We know what you do. I want to say, what is one key thing for you in your life? Maybe not for mental health, but just to get through the day, a routine, something that you do. It could be journaling that helps you run your life, so life doesn't run you.
Ooh, I like this question. And I can actually answer this question now. Because since I struggle so badly with ADHD up until recently, I didn't really have a routine. I didn't really have something to keep me in check. But something clicked recently, and I did a couple of interviews too, and it just reiterated the fact that I needed to do this. So, because they did this. So because I'm doing Mindfest and the podcast, and I'm working full time, and I'm trying to have a social life.
I get it, though. I understand.
Like, you do. You're in the same boat. I make lists. And I don't make a ton of lists because I don't want to overwhelm myself. I mean, I do have quite a few in my notes on my phone, but they're organized. But I have main lists. One for the podcast, one for Mindfest, and a personal. And I write things down in bullet points on those lists on my phone, on my home screen, and every day I check them.
Yeah.
And then when I do something, I check it off, and it's a godsend. And then 2, Google Calendar, and I color code everything.
Yes. Oh my God. I live by the Google Calendar. If it's not on the calendar, it's not happening. I'm sorry.
Legit, we are at that point, people. If it's not on the calendar, it's literally not happening.
Yep.
So I cannot reiterate, if you struggle with ADHD, if you just struggle with organization in general, creating a few lists for certain things, particular things within your life, Google Calendar. And also, the third thing is another form of a calendar. I have it in my kitchen on my wall. It's a dry erase board calendar. I put stuff on that every single day. I update it for every month. I fill out the whole month. And then as I go, game changer. Can't explain enough how much that's helped me.
It does. And just that visual, because
It's a visual,
some
yeah.
people are pretty organized, God bless them. I'm not. I don't know how I got get that gene. But, some people, they're fine. Us, we need to see it. We need to see, oh, okay, that block of yellow, I got to get on a podcast. Oh, that block of red, I got to go drive, somewhere to work or something.
Yeah.
So helpful. Oh my God. I love those. Great points. Great routines to have. So wrapping it up, where can they find you for your podcast, and where can they find out more about this event that's going on in May?
Absolutely. So podcast, you can find us on Instagram at the Wondering Mind Podcast. We're also on Facebook, the Wondering Mind Podcast, and on Twitter at TWM Podcast _. And then for Mindfest, right now we currently only have an Instagram at Mindfest Lou, but we are underway with a website, so that will be up within the next month. And again, you can find that when it goes live through Instagram.
That's going to be awesome. I'm so excited to see how that goes. I cannot wait to hear about it. So, Emily, thank you so much for coming on today's podcast, and I wish you luck in the rest of the year.
Thank you so much.